afternoon tea breakout group. Details will be made available in the chat space. So I am absolutely delighted to hand over to Professor Ilan Kelman, the Deputy Director of the Warning Research Centre, who will introduce our keynote speaker for today, Mami Mizutori, who we are so deeply honoured to have present today and help launch the Warning Research Centre. Thank you so much for being here. Ilan.
Thank you so much. So thank you, Karina, for the introduction and for leading us in the Warning Research Centre. I am Professor of Disasters and Health at University College London, half in the Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction, which is why we are here, and half in the Institute for Global Health. We owe a deep debt of gratitude to Mami Mizutori, who is a special representative of the United Nations Secretary General for Disaster Risk Reduction, making her head of UNDRR, the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. The role of UNDRR is to support countries and stakeholders in implementing the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, which began in 2015 and ends in 2030. And Mami also very kindly came and gave an in-person seminar to us at University College London in January 2019. So it is our honor and our pleasure to have her back here regarding the launch of the UCL Warning Research Centre. A reminder that we are looking for questions and discussion and challenges. So please do use a Q&A function, and we will have time at the end to moderate ideas, thoughts, queries, which Mami will be very happy to respond to. So thank you again for joining us. Please go ahead and we will ask Felice to please start sharing the slides. Thank you again, Mami, for joining us.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Kelman, for your kind introduction. And thank you very much for inviting me, Dr. Fernley, to give a keynote speech on the occasion of launching the UCL Early Warning Research Center during the 11th IRDR annual conference. I remember fondly of the time when I was invited by Professor Kelman to give a lecture seminar on DRR at UCL in 2019, just before, well, not just before, but a year before the pandemic started to affect all of us. And I'm delighted to come back to the vibrant campus of UCL, albeit virtually this time, and taking off my UN hat for a moment and putting on my Japanese hat. Some of you may know that UCL has a very special place in the minds of Japanese people, because it was at UCL where the very first Japanese students studied abroad after Japan opened up to the world in the 19th century, and many of those students became the founding fathers of modern Japan. So Japan owes a lot to UCL. Now, with my UN hat on again, I was listening this morning to Dr. Fernley's wonderful presentation on why warning matter. So much ground was covered in the presentation and the excellent panel discussion that followed. And I hope my speech can be a good complement from the viewpoint of the UN agency mandated with disaster risk reduction. In celebrating the establishment of your research center, let us first look at the strengths and challenges of early warning, early action systems. Many points were already raised this morning, but I'd like to go over them again because they're quite important. So over time, early warning systems have proven to unlock tremendous life-saving possibilities. It is employed by governments, villages, and communities, and of course the UN system from global to hyper-local levels. It is scalable, it should be inclusive of the needs and capacities of everyone if well designed, and can be linked to anticipatory action and other no regrets funding measures. Early warning system can also function as ways to bring together different stakeholders. We know of, for example, how early warning systems are involving the private sector in terms of data analysis and even setting up the systems and allowing partnership with the private sector to be established. These are the strengths that we know of, but then you have the challenges as you see in the slide. And the most relevant challenge with early warning system from the perspective of UNDRR is that they should include measures that move us towards disaster risk reduction and away from focusing on reactive response. And for this to happen, when we invest in early warning systems, we should do so while also making efforts to exhaust all other attempts to reduce risk, prevent, mitigate impact, and transfer residual risk. By positioning early warning systems adequately, it can work as a very important gateway to risk reduction by unlocking social and behavior change. Warning is an excellent way to open the door to conversation with and amongst communities and governments about what is possible, practical, and realistic in risk reduction. And if we fail to include in this dialogue the parties who create risk and those who would suffer most from the impact of disasters, early warning can create the impression of being quite isolated and top-down. Early warning systems should not be based on a single hazard model, and a major growth area would be to develop warnings related to non-natural hazards, including biological hazards and risks that have social dimensions. We encounter risk daily, and we are surrounded by risk. It's quite overwhelming. The nature of contemporary risks is that they are systemic and complex, like this very crowded slide is showing you. Sadly, it is human nature to procrastinate over things that are complex or for which informed decisions are difficult to make. We are very good at shifting responsibilities, but we need to be aware that no decision is risk neutral. Reducing or increasing risk is the result of decisions that we make, and unfortunately, drivers of risk are increasing. Climate change is currently the #1 exacerbator, #1 driver of disaster risk. And over the last 20 years, there has been a doubling of extreme weather events, such as storms, floods, heat waves, and drought, which in addition to their death tolls, have disrupted billions of lives and caused ever-increasing economic losses. Here, early warning systems are critical to saving lives and property when disaster looms. The global decline of mortality by disasters reported to the Sendai Framework Monitor System by member states can be attributed largely to the expansion of early warning, early action systems. However, I must say that this was the case before the COVID-19 pandemic, unfortunately. Setting up early warning systems is becoming more economical thanks to advances in technology. Using tools such as machine learning and mobile networks, in addition to radio and television through common alerting protocols, means that the cost of an early warning system can be significantly reduced compared to, let's say, 10 years ago. And of course, in many places, the use of technology is still combined with proven traditional ways, leveraging the power of the communities and indigenous knowledge. Investing in early warning and early action makes sense from many perspectives. There are estimates about the relative value of proactive risk reduction as opposed to reactive response. And as we know, there is no such thing as a natural disaster. Now, the audience of today, we know that, but actually when we listen to news, when we read articles, the two words, natural disaster, come together. And at UNDRR, we have been campaigning that there is no such thing as a natural disaster with partners on this. The truth is that there are hazards, both natural and human-made, and when they are combined with exposure and vulnerability, as explained this morning by Dr. Fernley and others, there you have risk. And as this slide shows you, death, loss, and damage are the function of the context of these three elements of hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. Now, in terms of early warning, good early warning systems are those which are based on extensive understanding on these three elements in the area it is operating for, so that the system can reach what we call the last mile and save the lives and the properties of the most vulnerable population and communities. Warnings have the capacity to do more than tell us when rains might turn to floods. They can tell us when forest humidity reaches dangerous levels, or when health systems become under-resourced to manage major pandemics, or when commodity prices threaten export viability of key crops, or when pollinators are under threat. Global trends like climate change or demographic changes can intensify and increase likelihoods of phenomena, as shown in the second part of the image you are seeing, such as displacement or price vulnerability. And when these risks compound, they can lead to multiple systemic failures, including food insecurity, forced migration, and even civil unrest. Warning thresholds for any of these phenomena are useful because we live in a world of cascading impact. Not only could early warning systems give alerts to potentially catastrophic effects, but they would also support early action to protect us from the failure of many systems. Now, the accuracy of hydromet forecasts and the quality of seismic warning tools is impressive, but we will never be able to fully predict the future. Science is indeed improving every year, and areas including warnings for non-hydromet hazards are an exciting growth area, and one I know that is part of the set of goals of your new research center. This is extremely important and useful work. And how can we further improve the use of existing resources, including data and tools? Needless to say, we need to connect warning to action. This may seem obvious, but we know that it is not always the case in reality. To this end, it is essential that early warning systems are complemented by risk communication. All too often, we face the last mile challenge where early warning information existed, but warnings were not acted upon. Warnings need to be communicated so that governments, districts, private business, and households understand the nature of the risk they face, and can take clear, informed decisions and actions at their respective levels. Ideally, these decisions and related actions need to be focused on preventing disaster rather than responding when lives and livelihoods have already been lost. Finally, as the chart on the right-hand side of this slide shows us, the type of hazards that we are exposed to are truly multiple. This was also emphasized by Dr. Fearnley this morning. So, early warning systems must also reflect this. We can save lives if we apply existing risk information to inform issues such as building codes, land use planning, and the enforcement of risk-based safety standards, and actually all measures that lead to disaster risk reduction. Currently, our thinking of early warning is focused, could I say, more on getting ahead of the hazard and increasing the speed and efficiency of reactive measures. It's important, but early warning system has further potential to contribute to proactive disaster risk reduction measures. Let me give you an example. Consolidated early warning data and information from various sources, when combined with good systems for application, This is key to protecting loss and damage of sectors such as agriculture from extreme hazard events. The UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, UNDRR, we convene partners and coordinate activities to create safer, more resilient communities. We are, as Professor Kelman kindly introduced, the custodian agency of the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction 2015 to 2030. We are the custodian agency within the UN system, and we support all UN member states and, importantly, all stakeholders to implement the Sendai Framework. Many of you listening in today might be aware of what the Sendai Framework is about and its 7 global targets, including reducing mortality, affected people, economic loss, and damage to infrastructure by disasters. And while the success of the Sendai Framework in 2030 will be measured indeed by the achievement of these targets, I think it's very important to remind ourselves of the overall goal of the Sendai Framework, which you can read in the slide, but because it is so important, allow me to read it. Prevent new and reduce existing disaster risk through the implementation of integrated and inclusive economic, structural, legal, social, health, cultural, educational, environmental, technological, political, and institutional measures that prevent and reduce hazard exposure and vulnerability to disaster, increasing preparedness for response and recovery, and thus strengthen resilience. It's a mouthful, but that is the essence of the Sendai Framework. And the Sendai Framework is indeed a departure from previous ways of thinking about disasters and disaster risk reduction. How so? There was a paradigm shift from disaster management to disaster risk management, a shift from ex post to ex ante. It is a people-centered preventive approach to disaster risk reduction. And while the primary responsibility to implement the Sendai Framework resides among the states, it is a shared responsibility with all stakeholders to implement Sendai Framework and make disaster risk reduction a reality. It's what we call all of society approach. And the scope of the document includes slow onset, man-made and biological hazards. We need to remind ourselves again, in 2015 already, the member states who had experienced SARS, MERS, Ebola, and the WHO, they really pushed for biological hazard to be put into Sendai Framework. And we were talking about the next disaster pandemics, and we are in it right now. Now, I would like to give you a sense of some of our work in the area of early warning. Our regional office for Africa is engaged in an early warning project to collate global flood data, eventually to be connected to national data sources, and is working in partnership with the African Union Commission to develop a continental situation room. Over time, this will incorporate more types of risk information and enrich exposure and vulnerability elements. And this part of working with the AUC is very important because, as we know, disasters do not respect borders. We are also working with individual countries in the continent, for example, in Malawi on food risk mapping and warning, and in Ethiopia on wildfire warning systems. Second, as part of the Global Risk Assessment Framework graph, on which I will touch upon a bit more in detail later, we are working with UN system partners to improve data analysis that can contribute to improve triggers for anticipatory action for events such as typhoons, where often major events can be detected even a week in advance. Third, UNDRR also participates, supports, and collaborates with a number of global networks working directly on early warning and anticipatory action, including CRUISE, which is the Climate Risk and Early Warning System, and REAP, the Risk-Informed Early Action Partnership. Fourth, as part of our work with the global risk science community, and the importance of science was, of course, much focused on in this morning's debate, we are in partnership with the International Science Council, the Integrated Research in Disaster Risk Reduction with its headquarters in Beijing, and RISCAN, among others. And we do this to promote innovative research and strengthen collaboration and funding for the science community that contributes to the achievement of the Sendai framework. Last year, in partnership with the International Science Council, we published an updated Sendai framework aligned hazard definition and classification report, which benefited from many academic contributions, including by Dr. Gianluca Pescaroli of UCL. Some of the specific themes of our engagement, UNDRR's engagement in these partnerships include promoting effective dialogue and cooperation between the scientific and technical communities and practitioners, enhancing the quality and accessibility of research to promote effective decision-making, especially by governments, advocating for increased investment to finance environmentally sound technology, science, and inclusive innovation and information sharing. And we are doing all this with the firm understanding that the risk science community is a crucial stakeholder in implementing the Sendai framework. And in a nutshell, our partnership with the academia and science is so important in order to support evidence-based disaster risk reduction. If it is not evidence-based, we cannot convince anyone about the importance of disaster risk reduction. In this context, the Sendai framework has 4 priorities for action, and the very first priority is to understand the risk that surrounds us in all its dimensions. However, despite global technological advances in generating risk information, many countries still face challenges in making the necessary information accessible and usable to decision makers. In particular, many countries lack a risk assessment approach that allows these countries to understand the systemic nature of risk. This is why, as the United Nations focal point agency for DRR, we have designed the Global Risk Assessment Framework, GRAF, as a long-term service to UN member states and UN country teams on the ground. The aim is to strengthen the capacity of national and subnational partners to generate, disseminate, and apply risk information into their plans, and to facilitate access and use of systemic risk information to support resilient development, humanitarian action, and public and private investment. We are currently in the process of piloting GRAF in several countries, and we hope that it will be used and adopted by many countries in order to understand the complex but much important systemic nature of risk that we are surrounded by. UNDRR also publishes the Global Assessment Report for Disaster Risk Reduction every 3 years. This is the UN flagship publication on risk and resilience, and it provides a global snapshot of the status of the art of understanding and managing disaster risk. Just last week, on the World Day to Combat Desertification and Drought on the 17th of June, we published our first special report of the GAR. And this one focused on drought risk so that we can understand this complex disaster risk better and we can take proactive risk reduction actions to tackle drought. We believe that drought has the potential to be the next pandemic due to its severe, but still seriously underestimated impact. And that is why the special report was on drought. The last, most recent GAL report was published in 2019. It focused on systemic risk before it became a reality under COVID-19. And the next GAL report will come out in 2022, next year, May, at the global platform, the Global Conference for Disaster Risk Reduction, which will be hosted by the government of Indonesia in Bali. These reports are the product of inputs from schools of scientists, researchers, practitioners, and governments, and we are very grateful for the input of several members of UCL, including Professor Ilan Kelman and Professor David Alexander. The UCL Warning Research Centre, launched today, is the only dedicated research center in the world looking at early warnings. It is most encouraging to see how the academic community continues its contribution to improve global risk information provision, including through this important center, which I understand will link established expertise with multi-sectoral partners, will aim to connect cutting-edge research with policy guidance and application, will connect hazard warnings to key strategies and other major themes, including adaptation, climate change, and sustainable development. As Professor Kelman already mentioned, I do look forward to a discussion today with all of you to see how, working together, we can better focus the next generation of thinkers and practitioners in disaster risk reduction, leveraging this most important center. The launch of the UCL Warning Research Center is timely and important. The center explicitly brings together not just researchers, but also practitioners, policymakers, media, the public, and importantly, will guide the next generation of students who will be adding their creativity, urgency, intelligence, and energy to some of the thorniest challenges of our time. It is truly another great example of a whole of society, all of society approach. So on behalf of UNDRR, I am pleased to welcome the UCL Warning Research Center to the rich network of organizations and individuals seeking to change the way we create safer and more resilient communities. I would like to congratulate all of you, and in particular, Professor Peter Salmons, Director of the UCL Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction, Professor Emma Tobin and Professor John Aga, heads of the UCL Department of Science and Technology Studies, Dr. Karina Fernley, founder and director of the UCL Warning Research Centre, and Professor Ilan Kelman, Deputy Director of the UCL Warning Research Centre. Disaster risk reduction is a relatively new area of study, but it is growing and there is so much still to do. I was delighted to hear in Professor Salmon's opening remarks this morning that IRDR is rapidly growing from strength to strength. I'm confident that at IRDR, both researchers and students are immersed in the various avenues to pursue in understanding and reducing risk. And at times, probably like myself, you may also be a bit daunted by the urgency of the challenge. At this time, where not only interdisciplinary, but transdisciplinary approaches are necessary for academia to provide solutions, real solutions to the challenges we face, DRR, disaster risk reduction, can be an area where this can happen. As I repeat so many times in my advocacy opportunities, nothing undermines sustainable development like disasters. And disasters affect the most vulnerable people disproportionately. But the important thing is that disasters do not have to devastate. And to achieve this, we need to forge a strong partnership with academia. 4 years into my post, one thing that I have been contemplating recently is what can UNDRR and myself do? What can we do in order to further enhance the status of the studying and research of disaster risk reduction? How can we make disaster risk reduction and resilience a major career path in academia, of course, but beyond in the public and private sector? For me, this is very important, not least because in this world of multiple hazards, systemic risk, and cascading impacts, we need to make all our decisions at all levels and sectors risk-informed. But this is not happening yet. And that is why we are experiencing devastating disasters one after another and simultaneously in many instances. We need to change this. And the only way to make this happen, to my mind, is to mainstream the study and research and application of DRR science and to make building resilience a commodity, a career for all. I once again congratulate the establishment of the UCL Warning Research Centre and look forward to working with you to save lives and livelihoods. A warm welcome to the newly born UCL Warning Research Centre. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mami. So kind, and really delighted to have these words and the incredible support which you're providing. I also, an apology to everyone. Mami was right and I was wrong. You actually did come to London in January 2020, so it was right before the pandemic. And we hope that there is no correlation between our interaction and global disasters. But it was wonderful to have that room full, and you provided so much inspiration, especially the time that you then spent with our students afterwards, which really leads directly to what you closed with about the next generation and careers. We have a huge cohort of over 70 master's students who have done most of their coursework and are now working on their dissertations to go into the wide world of employment as of September, at the same time that we are starting a new bachelor degree in global humanitarian studies. So in 3 years, we're going to have a wonderful cohort of youth coming out of university looking for humanitarian disaster careers. What advice might you give to all these students who are saying, I've done the degree, I'm now eager to get into the field? How do they do this?
I think the word that you used in a different way, but field is very important. I would really encourage many of your students and postgraduate researchers to go into the field and understand what is happening with disaster impact to now all countries, but in particular to the most at risk and vulnerable countries. And there to combine your knowledge, your expertise with what you experience on the ground, and then come back again to devise systems that bring all this together so that it will become a reality that everyone takes risk-informed decisions. But I mentioned at the end that I really want to see your students have a very clear career pathway. Is of course, for the people who have dedicated their years in the study, but also for the whole community, global community we're living in. We still are not preventing enough. We still are not prepared enough. And as was mentioned in the panel, we still are not ready enough. So we do need to really make this a reality. And in this journey, academia is so important. So let's do it together.
Sounds wonderful. I think that's really helpful also for us when we are giving career advice and we're trying to link to the UCL Careers Service, but also to you at the UN and all the practitioners that we have here, what they'll be looking for in order to match up with the students. Again, as Karina has just put in the chat, please do put questions in the Q&A. We have a long list of them. So Mami, would you like some technical questions on the Sendai framework, or would you like more general questions on warning and disasters?
Whichever you think is good. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay, let's start more focused. I understand that the Sendai framework is not a legally binding treaty. Is there any talk to make it so?
Not at this moment. Yeah, very right. That compared to the Paris Agreement, it's not a legal document. But again, Agenda 2030, the Sustainable Development Goals, that's not a legal document either. But does it make it any less because of it? I don't think so. The Sendai framework is addressing the most pressing challenge that we are facing right now. And it has to go hand in hand with Paris Agreement and all others. And if it doesn't go hand in hand, we cannot achieve the SDGs. So no, I do not hear of it, but 2023 will be the mid-term point of the Sendai framework. And we will have a midterm review. We will have a report coming out, and we will need to enhance a political commitment. And we will start thinking about not only towards 2030 or beyond. So that discussion may become a point if stakeholders and importantly member states feel that that is necessary.
Okay, thank you. And another technical question. Is part 2 of the UNDRR hazard terminology review going ahead? Cascading, complex, and systemic risks, I believe, with Professor Virginia Murray.
It is going ahead, and related to that, what is going ahead right now is that we are creating with the academics a profile of each and every of the 300 plus hazards that have been identified in the first report. That is what we are putting our focus in right now, and that's very important because if we don't understand the nature of the hazards, then it's very difficult to have a comprehensive responses. So that's what we're doing now, but I am confident that this area of the understanding of the hazards is something that will evolve.
Okay, and now a more general question. I think it is difficult to understand what is behind the spread of misinformation about the vaccine, and I'll also add in climate change as well as other aspects of the pandemic. Is it an orchestrated con? Is it just false beliefs that are quickly spread? I guess that I'll interpret the overall question is, what do we do about misinformation, disinformation, and abusive information within the disaster risk reduction realm?
Well, it's a very important question, isn't it? Because during COVID-19, and even before that, around climate emergency as well, we have been exposed to a lot of misinformation, disinformation. So the UN started a campaign called Verify. This means that when you receive information that you know, because of your expertise, because of your knowledge, that this is not true, or this may not be true, verify it. And if it's not true, don't pass it on. You know, the evolvement of social media has many, great, let's say, aspects to it. But then at the same time, if you're not careful by using social media, you can just, be a proliferator of misinformation, disinformation yourself. So my message is, let's stop doing it ourselves first. And the second thing is, as I mentioned, we need to really look into science and evidence. And I would also say, and this is a request to the science community, the academia, let's make your findings, your evidence accessible. Because sometimes because of the gap, because of the difficulty of accessing, and when I say access, it's not only physically accessing, but understanding, interpreting what science has found, then we tend to, go for easy solutions or easy answers, even if they are false. So I would say that science and academia has a very important role here to make your findings accessible so that people understand clearly what is misinformation, disinformation, and what is not.
And we hope we're doing that. We obviously need continual feedback from you in terms of how we're succeeding, whether it's through seminars like this, the one you kindly came to, our annual report, the blogging we do. So yeah, we'll do what we can and just let us know how we're achieving or what else we could do better.
Absolutely.
There are also two questions which have emerged from the careers discussion. So a master's student in disaster risk reduction writes, I have found career prospects daunting. There seems to be a lack of entry-level jobs that don't require 3 or more, 5 or more, 10 or more years of related experience in an international disaster setting. Where should we look for this experience?
Yeah, it is daunting, isn't it? And I think the challenge, the richness, but the challenge of disaster risk reduction as an academic field is because it's about so many things. At the end of the day, it's about everything that we are facing, right? But I would say that, hone your skills and your expertise on one aspect of disaster risk reduction while looking at everything. It can be the social aspect of disaster risk reduction, how vulnerability is really the very, I should say, the crucial element that makes disaster devastating. There is not, for example, in my mind, enough yet research on vulnerability. Excuse me, we talked about risk communication. I think that's another area that can be more researched. So I would say that, find your niche within the DRR studies, but never to forget to connect it to all other aspects. Don't make it a siloed research. And in that way, I'm sure that, it will become a career. Look, the private sector is looking at disaster risk reduction more than ever. It used to be the insurance sector, and the insurance sector, which is more about risk transfer, as you know, is now looking at how can the insurance sector contribute more to prevention and disaster risk reduction. And I'm confident that it's not only about insurance sector anymore. It's about the wider financial sector and even, all other industries, given that disasters really affect everyone. So I do believe that the private sector will be looking more and more for risk experts. And of course, as you have mentioned, Professor Kelman, UN is one entry point. Just to give you a very concrete entry point, we are looking for a lot of interns at this time. Not only in Geneva, but in Nairobi, in Bangkok. And in a way, because of the challenges of COVID-19, internship is becoming a bit more like telecommuting internships. So there are a lot of opportunities there. Please, if you are interested, look at the openings. My special assistant, Felice, who is with us today here, she can be reached by any one of you. I don't know, Felice, if you have a slide of your email address, but I can provide it later. Maybe, Felice, you can provide it in the chat. And if you're interested, really do apply, because that's one entry point. And then there are a lot of JPOs, which are sponsored by several countries, which will bring you also into not only, but UNDRR and the UN system. And we are not the only ones who are doing disaster risk reduction now. Within the UN system, disaster risk reduction is becoming a very much cross-cutting theme. So at other organizations such as FAO, WFP, OCHA, it's an area where more and more focus is given.
Thank you. And also for that opportunity regarding the internships, which actually leads to the second career question, which was posted earlier. How do we enable those keen and talented disaster scholars and activists without private funds to enter the field and not have to do internships without remuneration?
Well, that's a challenging question, because I have to be honest here. UN internship does not provide, especially within the UN Secretariat where UNDRR belongs, remuneration. And it's, if you do choose to come to Geneva, it's not a cheap place. So I fully understand. But we will trying to create more opportunities for especially students coming from Global South. We are constantly looking for donors to support, if not interns, junior professionals from Global South. And we need to do more, but we are on that path. So this is, it may not seem a lot, but we will try to do better on this. And I do hope that this will provide opportunities for those who are looking into their career in disaster risk reduction.
Okay, thank you. Now to pivot it back to warnings, which is really the reason we're here, how could international cooperation, particularly for South-South cooperation, support regional early warning practice?
So as I mentioned, we are already working with the African Union Commission in order to create an African continent-wide early warning system, but also in the sub-regions as well. For example, in the Horn of Africa with IGAD, the Intergovernmental Agency for Development, and with support from Sweden, we are trying to establish a early warning operation unit within IGAD, so that the early warning system becomes a regional one. And I believe that these are examples of South-South cooperation, because eventually IGAD and other regional intergovernmental organizations in Africa will, and they are already cooperating with the African Union Commission. So it is happening, and it is one of the, I would say, areas where South-South cooperation can really be effective, because as we know, disasters do not respect borders. And if the early warning system stops at the border, then it's not effective, as we all know. So it is happening, and I think that it's an area that will be even more focused. Donors are very, very interested in supporting early warning systems, which are transboundary. And donors are also interested in using early warning system to expand what is called anticipatory aid. So anticipatory aid, as many of you may know, is not to wait until an extreme weather event, for example, destroys lives and livelihoods. It is to, based on early warning and on data, to provide the aid in advance so that people can be well prepared, better prepared, and the impact can be mitigated. And this is something that is gaining a lot of interest right now, not least because there is not enough money for humanitarian aid post-disaster anymore. So many disasters happening all over the place that with all the generosity of donors, the gap between what needs to be provided and what is provided, this is getting bigger and bigger. So this is why anticipatory aid is now a big focus. And here, South-South cooperation, I think, can be a very, very crucial element.
Another gap which has been raised in the questions, do you think disagreements in public statements by different scientific experts have diminished public trust? And perhaps maybe comment on that specifically when warnings are given and when different scientific experts disagree in public about warnings.
So I don't know exactly which example this question is the person who asked the question has in mind, but the short answer is it could. But I think what could be the solution is that if we have better data around disaster risk, then the discrepancy among experts can be less. The issue that we face is that we do not still have enough data around the hazard, exposure, and importantly, the vulnerability. And when it comes to disaggregated data by gender, by sex, by income, or other elements, there is very, very poor data. So if we can all bring our force together to have better data, then better analysis, evidence-based analysis will be done. And I believe that that will lead to narrowing the gap, the difference between different experts, and that will definitely help.
Which actually leads directly to the next question. Do you see any move to engage more fully with sexual and gender minorities during disasters, and ideally in whatever framework replaces Sendai? This group has been excluded from the Sendai framework, but multiple pieces of research have shown that they experience a greater level of vulnerability during these events.
So I don't agree that Sendai excludes these people because Sendai is a people-centered document. Sendai is a whole of society approach. The word not to leave anyone behind is not in Sendai because it was later created during that year when other agreements were negotiated. However, the seed of this was created in Sendai when Sendai became a people-centered document and when the vulnerability issue became very focused. And absolutely, the issue of the minorities and let's say the people who are most vulnerable, whether by gender or whether by the sex or whether by people living with disability or indigenous people. This is front and center in what we are doing. And if it hadn't appeared so yet, then we have to do a better job. But to assure you, we just concluded our strategic framework, UNDRR strategic framework from 2022 to 2025, in which we have agreed that gender equality will be mainstreamed in every part of our strategy. But it's not only about gender, it's about inclusivity, bringing in all the minorities into this. And the other thing that we really promote is that we, when we work with governments so that they have their national platforms for disaster risk reduction and their national strategies for disaster risk reduction, what we emphasize most is include the minority, include the vulnerable people, make their voices part of your strategy, and also make them part of the implementation of the strategies and policies around disaster risk reduction, unless it is not an effective policy.
What would you say is a one key takeaway that governments can apply from the global risk assessment process? And I'll add, does it relate to warnings?
The one takeaway for governments. I think the one thing that there are many things that governments have to do, but I would say that really, to focus on the systemic nature of risk, because still many governments, when looking systemic nature of risk and the multi-hazard aspect of hazard. This is something that, when we started looking very quickly at the national strategies of governments after COVID outbreak, we found out that a lot of them are still quite single hazard. And most of them do not look at the systemic nature of risk. As a result, the agencies for disaster risk management, the agency for public health, they are all siloed and they do not talk to each other. And therefore, the response to systemic risk is not systemic nor comprehensive. This is where we need to change. And early warning system can also be a very important part of it by being a multi-hazard early warning system. And I think this is the most important lesson, let's say, that we've learned from COVID. And I hope that the lesson doesn't go away.
And on that note, regarding systemic risk and bringing together fields, we have two questions on climate change, which sort of collate. So first, what could we do to increase the synergy between work and directives on climate change adaptation and those on disaster risk reduction? Should more be done at the international level? Which links to the question, in the case of human-caused climate change, should the frame be risk and disaster prevention rather than risk reduction?
So very interesting questions. Yes, we are we are enhancing our work on what we call the coherence between disaster risk reduction policy and climate adaptation policy. At the global level, within the UN system, we are working very closely with UNFCCC so that these two policies, which have a lot in common, are coherent, but importantly, that climate adaptation policies are risk informed. I think this is important. That's what we're doing at the global level. And at the country level, we are trying to bring this down to the country level so that the policies of countries are coherent. The Pacific Islands are already doing it. They put together the disaster risk reduction policy and the climate adaptation policy, and they bring it towards the Sustainable Development Goals. So it's already happening, interestingly, in countries where resource is not actually very rich, but we need to do this at a larger scale. And then so Ian, remind me, so instead of disaster risk reduction, it should be prevention?
Yeah, the suggestion was prevention rather than risk reduction.
Yeah, I think that's a very good suggestion, because it's all about prevention, isn't it? But prevention is, because prevention is so important in every aspect, not only in terms of disaster, but also conflict and whatnot. Prevention is already there as an agenda, important for the Secretary General. In our case, we're focusing on disaster. Yes, the words that we've been using, disaster risk reduction, but in our narrative, what we emphasize is effectively always prevention. Being more preventative, being more proactive, instead of being reactive and picking the pieces after a disaster destroys us.
And final question, which apologies leaves 10 unasked, but please do continue in the chat and we can obviously continue outside this venue. So the final question, poor or poor capacity for disaster management and disaster risk management at national and local level is arguably one of the major drivers of disaster risk. What can we do about it? So,
absolutely. And that is why UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, we have a global education and training institute based in Incheon, Republic of Korea, which is our institute, which focuses on capacity development, because indeed, the lack of capacity is one of the risk drivers. So we are increasing training in terms of not only its the numbers, but also the reach. We are training more and more trainers so that capacity development can be enhanced. It's a challenge because sometimes, you develop the capacity of certain people and then they go away and then you have to do it again. It's kind of a challenge that we are all facing in all areas. But absolutely, that is important. And that is one area where we emphasize to the member states, both donors and the Global South, so that capacity development is at the center of our activities.
Well, thank you so much. And again, thank you for launching the center, for giving the keynote, for responding to a wide range of questions, but really all that you're doing to bring universities, science, and especially students into the wider system to contribute. And hopefully it's not just us taking, but you have to let us know, please, what else can we give regarding science, regarding education, regarding students, regarding universities. We are here to serve society through science. You're doing so much for